Well, you mentioned, Sina, that this is not really a new story in terms of the dozens of coups that the United States has sponsored in Latin America. And this is yet another example of that. But it's also not a new story going back even further, hundreds of years, and that this is a very clear example of the continuation of this process of settler colonialism, where Peru, for the first time in modern history, has an indigenous descent president, similar to Evo Morales in Bolivia, and he's only allowed to govern for 17 months, and he's overthrown in a U.S.-backed coup and replaced with the European descent racist elites. So there are so many parallels going back to this process of European colonization, and we see that across Latin America, there still is an attempt to fully decolonize, because there were decolonial movements, anti-colonial movements that have achieved independence from Spanish colonialism, famously led by figures like Simón Bolívar and Francisco Morazán. But those anti-colonial struggles obviously still continue today against neocolonialism. And Peru, of all countries in the region, may be one of the best examples of that. This is a country like Bolivia that has a majority indigenous descent population, and yet they never really had an indigenous descent president until 2021, when the people of Peru elected Pedro Castillo. Who is Pedro Castillo? He is a teacher and a union organizer and a farmer from a very poor rural area in Peru. And he became prominent because he led a teacher strike. So he was not a politician. He had no political experience, but he became a national figure because he was the leader and the figurehead of a teacher strike. And that's why during his presidential campaign, people probably saw that his symbol was a pencil. He walked around with this like giant pencil, and that was a symbol of the fact that he was a teacher from a rural area. And in this rural area where he was a teacher, he was also a farmer, because most people there were subsistent farmers, or if it wasn't at least subsistence farming, they were just farming to have some extra income or some extra food. And in Peru, the political system has been dominated for hundreds of years by foreign elites, or I should say that many of them were born in Peru, but they're from families that were either colonizing families of European descent, or from, in the case of the dictatorship, of a Japanese family. Peru had a fascist dictator who governed the country from 1990 until 2000, named Alberto Fujimori, and his family still dominates a lot of Peruvian politics. And I'm not, trying to engage in like a nativist. That's a bad word. I shouldn't use the term nativist. That's the term people use. But like, I'm not saying that like people who immigrate to Peru can't be Peruvian. But this is a discourse that you hear a lot from working class Peruvians, many of whom are of indigenous descent, who are critiquing the fact that their political class is very disproportionately dominated by people who are clearly of European descent or Japanese. In the case of not just the Fujimoris, in the case of a more recent president, his name was Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, which is clearly, he's of Polish descent. And there's so many examples of, these leaders in Peru that have like Polish last names, German last names, Japanese last names. Clearly, there's a problem here where the political class does not represent the vast majority of Peruvians. It represents this small minority of comprador elites who are concentrated in Lima. And Lima is a relatively international city. It's a city with significant dominance of finance capital. And of course, we know that there's a direct parallel between the comprador international bourgeoisie and finance capital. They're much more interested in international capital than they are in developing the national industry in their country. And Peru is a good example of that. So in Peru, you've had 7 presidents in 6 years, and 4 of those 7 presidents worked at the World Bank or New York-based banks. So you have basically a dictatorship run by the comprador bourgeoisie, people who have dual passports. I mentioned the president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. He literally had U.S. citizenship, and he worked in the United States for over 25 years. He was born in Peru, but he lived in the United States for over 25 years. He worked at the World Bank. He worked at New York investment banks, and he had U.S. citizenship until 2015. he gave up his U.S. citizenship in order to run for president in 2016. So that context is important to understand who Pedro Castillo is, because obviously there's a major class element. He's from a poor rural area, and he's going up against the wealthy capitalist elites in Lima. But there's very much a racial element as well, in that the indigenous descent majority of Peru have been completely left out of the mainstream bourgeois political system. So Pedro Castillo comes into power in 2021, and immediately, at first, the right-wing opposition refused to acknowledge his victory, and then immediately after he comes in, they launched a series of coup attempts. And in just over a year, the Peruvian Congress, which is dominated by the right-wing oligarchy, and it's notoriously corrupt. In September of 2021, the Peruvian Congress had a 7% approval rating, which is not really that much different from the US, but anyway, it had a 7% approval rating. And in the span of just over a year, the Peruvian Congress tried to launch 3 congressional coups against Pedro Castillo, the elected president. And it is true that there were a lot of people on the Peruvian left and part of the social movements that were very critical of Castillo because he wasn't able to do anything, because the left only had a small minority in the Congress, the right wing had a vast majority, and because at every single level, he never controlled the judiciary, which was waging judicial war against him, known as lawfare. He never controlled the military and the police, who arrested him, as we'll talk about in a second. And he certainly didn't control the Congress. I mean, not only did he not have a majority, but the Congress was constantly launching this attempt that they call presidential vacancy. And this goes back to the Peruvian Constitution, which was written by the U.S.-backed Fujimori dictatorship in 1993. He dissolved Congress unconstitutionally and created a new constitution with basically no democratic insight. It was just, he claimed that the people supported it, but it was just fake. And he created this new neoliberal constitution. This is right at the beginning of, this neoliberal unipolar era in the early 1990s. And he basically made it impossible for the Peruvian state to challenge neoliberal policy. It was baked into the very constitution. And then he launched this war of extermination against the left. And the left in Peru, socialist and revolutionary movements, tend to be largely associated with not just people who are poor and working class, but especially with indigenous descent Peruvians. So he also led a genocidal campaign. And Fujimori, actually, during the dictatorship in the 90s, he sterilized at least 300,000 indigenous descent Peruvians. And those are according to official government statistics. The actual figure could be higher. And by the way, the U.S. government funded that extermination program, the sterilization program, which is textbook genocide, through USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is a CIA cutout. They funded so-called family planning programs in Peru, which were just, cover for sterilization of indigenous descent Peruvians. So anyway, that constitution is still the constitution that Peru has today. And one article of the constitution, which is Article 113, gives the Congress the authority to dissolve the presidency with what they call an act of presidential vacancy if the 2/3 of the unicameral Congress decide that the Peruvian president is morally incapable, has moral incapacity. Obviously, that doesn't really mean anything. What the actual constitutional article says is physical or moral incapacity. Obviously, physical incapacity would be, like some kind of health problem. But moral incapacity means nothing. So that means that if the right-wing oligarchy, the comprador millionaire elites in Peru can bribe enough members of the Congress to vote for presidential vacancy, they can overthrow the democratically elected president. And there are videos that were leaked in this scandal that's called the Mamani Video scandal. And in that scandal, you could see the son of the former fascist dictator, Alberto Fujimori. His son was bribing other members of Congress, this was back in 2018, to vote for or against presidential vacancy. So it shows very clearly that the Peruvian Congress is an instrument of the, capitalist class. They can just bribe people and they can overthrow any elected president they want if the president is going against their economic interests. And that's exactly what happened against Pedro Castillo 3 times. However, on the 3rd time, the day of the vote, which was December 7th, 2022, Pedro Castillo got word, knowing that they were going to try to launch this congressional coup against him, and they had whipped enough votes through bribery and corruption and all of that. So he went on TV and he gave a speech announcing the temporary closure of Congress. Now, that's an important word there. Temporary. He was not permanently going to close the Congress like Fujimori did. And what he did, unlike Fujimori, was constitutional according to Article 134 of the Constitution, which allows the president to dissolve Congress if the Congress has on 2 occasions taken political action against or denied the appointment of the Council of Ministers, which is the cabinet. And Congress has done that against Pedro Castillo. So he was in his constitutional right to temporarily dissolve the Congress. The Constitution said that he had to call for new elections within 4 months. And he said he was going to call for elections. But because he tried to temporarily dissolve Congress, the oligarchy, the Congress, used this as an opportunity to carry out the coup against him. And the military arrested him. And he was sentenced to 18 months in so-called preventative prison without a real trial, without due process. So this is a clear coup. It's a coup d'etat. Now, because he tried to dissolve Congress, and because, even though he did it constitutionally, Fujimori, the US-backed fascist dictator, also had dissolved Congress 20 years before, that led to this media narrative, and it was spread by the US Embassy as well. And obviously the US Embassy was behind this coup, that supposedly Castillo was carrying out a self-coup, which is what Fujimori had did. But that's ridiculous, because what Castillo did was actually legal and constitutional, ironically, according to the very constitution created by Fujimori that Castillo wanted to change. And one of his main campaign promises when he ran for president in 2021 is that he wanted to change the Fujimori dictatorship constitution and have a constituent assembly to create a constitution and to turn Peru into a plurinational state that recognizes the indigenous nations and their languages. That is based on the model that Bolivia implemented under Evo Morales. So that was one of his main promises. But of course, he was never able to implement that promise because of the constant obstructionism by the Congress, by the judicial attacks, by the corrupt judiciary, the lawfare attacks. So he was going to try to create a new constitution, but immediately after, the military arrested him. And then 3 hours after he made that decision, after he made that video, and by the way, in the video, he's alone. He's not surrounded by the military. And in fact, his hands are shaking. He's clearly terrified of what could potentially happen to him. He knew that he could potentially be killed or arrested. And in 3 hours after that announcement, the Congress, the right-wing corrupt Congress with 7% approval, they appoint his vice president, who was completely corrupt and an opportunist, and she had been expelled from the socialist party that he had been part of, which is the Peru Libre party. She had been expelled from that party in January, and she said that she didn't even believe in the ideology. So she's a corrupt opportunist, and she was appointed president by the corrupt Congress, and immediately on the floor of Congress, she announced that she's going to create a government of national unity and a truce with the right-wing opposition. So what that means is that the right-wing opposition who lost the elections in the Congress were going to be given half of the seats in the cabinet as a political truce. So this is a coup in which the right wing that lost the elections was given control of the government, including most of the most important ministries. And of course, she's a puppet. Her name is Dina Boluarte. She's a complete puppet. She doesn't control anything. What really has happened is that the U.S. Embassy clearly backed this coup, and I can talk more about how we have evidence that the U.S. Embassy was directly behind this coup, And the U.S. ambassador in Peru, Lisa Kenna, is a so-called former CIA agent. And as we all know, there's no such thing as a former CIA agent. She was a CIA agent for 9 years, according to her State Department bio. And she was appointed the ambassador to Peru. And one day before the coup, the CIA agent turned U.S. ambassador Lisa Kenna, she met with the Peruvian defense minister, who's the one who on the day of the coup gave the order to the military not to allow Pedro Castillo to temporarily dissolve Congress, to go against Pedro Castillo. So the U.S. Embassy was clearly behind this. The U.S. State Department was clearly behind this. They immediately recognized Dina Boluarte as the president, and immediately the coup regime cracks down with brutal violence, leading to a massacre because there were huge protests, especially in rural and poor areas, especially among indigenous descent Peruvians. And there were huge protests with three main demands. The first demand was closing the Congress. So Pedro Castillo's attempt to close Congress was very popular among poor and working Peruvians, working class Peruvians. They supported that decision to close the Congress, while the right-wing millionaire oligarch-controlled media in Peru and the U.S. Embassy, they were the ones accusing Castillo of trying to launch a coup, which is insane. It's like blaming the victim of a coup of supposedly trying to carry out a coup. So if you listen to what people in the streets are saying, and I've interviewed people in Peru, and I've done a lot of translations of videos of the protests. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to go to Peru because one, it's very difficult to fly to Peru because the airports were closed because of the protests, but also it's just insanely expensive to even fly in the first place. But anyway, the point is, if you listen to what the protesters are saying in Peru, they're saying that they support the attempt to close the Congress. They want to close the Congress. Their other demand is new elections as soon as possible. And their other demand is releasing Pedro Castillo, because I mentioned he's been arrested and imprisoned for 18 months without trial. And finally, their most important demand is a constituent assembly to create a new constitution and a plurinational state, which is what Castillo had tried to do but was never able to accomplish. And now, finally, that brings us to the violence. So after the coup, there are these massive protests, especially in rural areas, and the coup regime responded by deploying not only the police but also the military, and they massacred at least 28 protesters in a bloodbath with potentially hundreds wounded. I mean, just horrifying videos showing that these very heavily militarized police and soldiers, and even the Peruvian government has what is officially an autonomous human rights watchdog, which is not really that autonomous, but even they had to acknowledge that the Peruvian coup regime, completely backed by the U.S. government, the Peruvian coup regime sent soldiers out with live ammunition and with helicopters, and these soldiers were shooting protesters from helicopters and dropping tear gas bombs on them from helicopters. So that led to a massacre of at least 28 protesters. And in the meantime, the U.S. State Department was totally supporting the coup regime. The CIA agent turned U.S. Ambassador Lisa Kenna met with the fake president, Dina Boluarte, and took a photo with her, praising her and saying that she represents the democratic will of the Peruvian people, despite not being elected. And Antony Blinken had a phone call with her, saying that she represents the democratic will of the Peruvian people. The State Department spokesman, Ned Price, who's also a so-called former CIA agent, so a CIA agent turned State Department spokesman, he gave comments praising Dina Boluarte and her coup regime as she was massacring protesters, and said she represents the democratic will of the Peruvian people. And of course, the Organization of American States, the OAS, which is basically an instrument of U.S. geopolitical power in the region, they also gave their approval, the rubber stamp, to support the coup regime in Peru. However, there is something very interesting happening. 14 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have refused to recognize the coup regime and still support Pedro Castillo as the constitutional president. They have made comments condemning the coup and calling for Castillo to be released from prison, including some of the most populated countries in the region, such as Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, also Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Honduras, and multiple Caribbean nations, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Grenada. So what we're seeing is a massive rebellion, not only by the people of Peru, but also a rebellion by Latin America and the Caribbean. 14 countries have rebelled against this U.S.-backed coup. So it shows that the situation is different now. It's very different from even 2019, when there were still a lot of right-wing governments that controlled most of, not most, but several governments in the region. And when Evo Morales was overthrown in a coup, he did get support from Mexico and Argentina. But now Colombia has been a new addition, and Lula da Silva comes into power in Brazil on January 1st. So the region is shifting back to the left, and it's very different from the coups back, for instance, in 2012 against Fernando Lugo or 2016 against Dilma Rousseff. There are parallels with that, but we see that Latin America is publicly condemning this coup and challenging the U.S. So that's a very, it's not brief, I guess, but that's a nutshell overview of everything in Peru to understand what's happening.